Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and what we're going to be working on today is a little different from the normal. What I normally do when I come down here is I feed some of these bins over here that have worms living in them. And feeding the worms might be a small part of what we're doing today. The main part of what we're doing today, though, is going to actually be relocating worms out of their old home into their new home. And the old home is usually all the way on the left over there. So I got my oldest going from left, newest going all the way to the right, and over here are the bins into which I plan on placing worms today. As you can see, there's no labels on these yet. They'll only get the labels once they're occupied by worms. So we'll be coming back to these at the end when it comes time to release them, but we've got to start by rounding up the worms first. So we're going to make our way all the way over here to where the oldest systems are. These are the bins right here that have the ANC worms living in them. African night crawlers live in these systems. These systems are now 320 days of age, and over the last 20 of those 320 days, the systems have only been getting fed over on this near edge of both bins in order to try to round up the worms that live in this material. So we did come in here halfway through that 20 days, 10 days ago, just to see how the migration was progressing, to reinforce the migration by adding a little bit of fresh bedding, moisture, and food to these so-called horizontal migration feeding zones. And my hope is that today we've rounded up enough worms with which to launch 2 new systems. So I'm going to get my glove on, get these 2 systems up on the bench, and we're going to get to work. I believe that most of the information on this green board is stuff that we've touched on already in terms of African night crawlers, 320 days of age, 20 days of migration going on here. So I figured I would bring this out really quick before I start getting my hands dirty and just make mention of how down here, 76 days. It's been 76 days now since I whipped up that batch of bedding that you saw in those 2 black tubs. Bedding that was intended for the worms living in here as their new home. That's 2.5 months. So at some point, 2.5 months ago, I was already anticipating this day of needing to give these worms a new home. I think the way that played out was that I had already even started into some sort of a process that was intended to try to get the worms to want to leave their old environment. I'm not sure if I might have started into the process that I refer to as foraging. Perhaps the worms were kind of not being fed for a little while, giving them a chance just to break down the residual material in their systems. And we basically scrapped that, and we continued on with a number of different feedings. And it was only 20 days ago that we decided to once again see what we could do about trying to get the worms out of here and into a new home. So that material in those 2 black tubs has been sort of priming and becoming really cozy and comfortable for the worms. So I'm pretty sure they're going to be quite happy to get moved into that nice batch of fresh bedding. And it does also seem like we're not only going to be moving worms over today, it does seem like we've got a good number of springtails occupying these systems. Both of them have signs of springtail activity, especially over here in bin number 2. And well, you know, it is what it is, right? Springtails, most people will tell you, are just a really good helper creature in your worm bins. So even though they're a little bit freaky, at least from my point of view, they're a little freaky to have in my worm bins because I'm just not used to having them in my worm bins. But after a while, you just sort of grow accustomed to the fact that, hey, you know, worm bins typically have helper creatures living in them, and usually, as long as you're comfortable referring to them and considering them as helpers, they're really not doing you any harm. So we're going to just push some of this material over here aside. You know, before we move on, I might as well just explain this other thing here. I did explain this in the last check-in too, 10 days ago, which is how I refer to this material out here that I'm raking off to the side as the castings that were accumulated over the course of 26 feedings. And then those other 2 feedings out of the 28 total feedings that have gone into here have been ones that were placed only into the horizontal migration feeding zones intended to round the worms up out of their castings, and it's stuff that's not going to remain in the batch of harvested stuff at the end. It's just stuff that's most likely just going to accompany the worms into their new home. So I guess in a way, I thought it might be interesting to know that, hey, you know, when it comes time to harvest, and this is the material that you actually end up with in the end, it's the product of 26 feedings, not 28 feedings. 28 feedings is the number of times I came in here with food for these worms, but 26 of them was for the purposes of producing these worm castings over on the side closer to me. 2 of them were for the purposes of trying to round the worms up for relocation, and are most likely just going to be castings that accompany the worms when they get moved into their new home. So that's just something I began doing a while ago, because it did seem like it was a little bit misleading, because if you were to set up numerous recurrences of this horizontal migration feeding zone in order to round up the last of the worms, then you are sort of skewing the numbers. Not that the numbers are all that important, but I always kind of update my tracking spreadsheet with information about these systems as time goes on, and sometimes I wonder if maybe, you know, I can glean some additional insightful information about my worm bins just by having fairly detailed records about them on hand. So that's just me. I enjoy, you know, keeping track of my information. Some people aren't all that concerned with that, so I guess for those of you that are not all that concerned with that sort of stuff, then apologies for the boring mumbo jumbo. So I do intend to simply excavate and remove the contents of both horizontal migration feeding zones, and I've got a couple plastic tubs on standby into which we can place the material, and I'm just here and there bumping into little bits of stuff that to me seems like it's not finished castings. My fingers rake across something a little bit larger. I just feel like it probably belongs over in the horizontal migration feeding zone, only because I like the idea of what I'm pulling in my direction as being pretty much finished castings only for the most part. Naturally, little bits and pieces of residual stuff is still in here, and at some point in the future I may or may not process this stuff to make it even finer by running it through my screen and separating any sort of residual larger chunks of stuff that are not worm castings. Or maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just leave it in there and just treat it as additional stuff that will just continue to break down over time and serve as a form of nourishment for the inhabitants of my finished castings, which at that point will theoretically not even be worms anymore. It'll just be the microorganisms that really make your worm castings the beneficial gardening substance that they are. So this was really all I was after. I don't need to be terribly precise. I just wanted to be able to segment the feeding zone from the finished castings prior to doing the haul out. So let's start. Let's get the horizontal migration feeding zone from this one extracted. And I think you might have noticed that the section of the container that I refer to as the finished castings are still occupied with worms. So at some point I do believe that I'll be resetting the horizontal migration feeding zones to let the process continue. I mean, another thing that I've done in the past was to simply take all the castings from 2 completed systems like this and to use one of my slightly larger containers to house all that material, and then I'll maybe set up a baiting station into which I try to round up the worms in the end. So I'm still trying to decide on what the next steps are here. Chances are I'll probably just come in here with some fresh bedding, fresh food, and reset these migration feeding zones. In fact, I'll probably also extract a lot of this material that's still good, useful bedding that doesn't need to necessarily go with the worms into their new home. Perhaps after the worms dive down into this batch of stuff, I could skim off the unused bedding and food and use that stuff, since it's really nicely seasoned, and rebuild the feeding zone using that stuff. So I think we've got ourselves a nice collection of worms here. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of bedding and food in here too. And that'll be what we'll consider to be the haul out of bin number 1. Let's proceed to doing the same over in bin number 2. As you can see, I've still got some castings material down here that's got some worms living in it. We're clearly not at the end of the game here, so we're not going to be sweating the fact that we've not gotten every last worm out. In the past, what I've done was I've, like I mentioned earlier, I've actually taken all this material. So if we were to do that again here, in this case, the material would all be just dumped into one single, somewhat larger container, and then I would set up a bait box, and I would attempt to round up the worms into the bait box. And part of the motivation that gets the worms to come into that bait box is one based on attraction. So I make the contents of the bait box really damp, full of yummy foods. And once worms make their way into there, they realize that they've stumbled on a really cozy spot to stay, and hopefully they remain in there until such a time that I can extract the bait box and move the worms on to be reunited with all the worms that were extracted and hauled out previously. The other part of that equation, though, is repulsion. So I'll keep that bait box covered so that it can remain nice and damp and not dry out to evaporation. But the rest of the contents of the container will be left to slowly dry out. And most of you will probably be able to guess that if the material becomes dry, the worms will have no interest in being in it, and they'll go looking for something better, and chances are they'll stumble on the bait box and find it to be something that they really enjoy occupying, and they'll just stay there until I round them up. And that's actually worked really well for me in the past, right to the point where I would almost say that the material had been completely evacuated of worms. So my idea here today was to not spend time on the video reconstructing these horizontal migration feeding zones, because really it just consists of, you know, piling some bedding material in here, mixing in some food, covering it up, and letting the process continue. I might even go ahead and just, you know, place a link to my video from 20 days ago that I created showing that process, where I, you know, try to separate these nice castings from what I've created over on this side. So yeah, you know, if you're interested, then, you know, go check out how I do that, but I think I'll be doing that off camera. I think the only thing we're going to still do here today is bring out those fresh new bins, launch off the worms, and that'll be it. We'll have a couple brand new African nightcrawler worm systems. I might even try picking some of this material out of here so that it can be recycled and not just be taken with the worms to their new home. So maybe I'll play with that a little bit off camera. But for now, I'm taking a short break so I can get these systems off the bench, get the new bins out here so we could do the worm release, and that's where the fun begins. So I'll be right back. All right, that's it. Fast forward many hours. I don't know what came over me, but you know, I started tilling through this material just to get it all sort of spread back out into each of the containers, and I decided I'm going to leave this stuff uncovered. And everything that got hauled out of the horizontal migration feeding zones, I actually sifted through all that stuff, did a light separation, and actually got all the worms rounded up. And yeah, that's a time-consuming task. I even held on to all of that bedding material and leftover foods that made up those 2 horizontal migration feeding zones, so that at some point soon I can set up a baiting station in each of these bins to try to continue rounding up the remaining worms. It did seem to me, just from spreading that stuff around within each of the bins, that there really wasn't a lot of worms remaining. So I thought I would let this stuff dry a little bit, till in the top surface after it has had a chance to dry, possibly giving the worms that still remain in the stuff, the stragglers, a little bit of motivation to go seek out something better. And then I would set up bait stations in each of the systems to try to round up the stragglers. So here's what I ended up with. I got the scale out and I weighed what was going on in this little container here, subtracted the weight of the container itself, and I ended up with what appears to be 1 pound 6 ounces, just shy of 1.5 pounds of African night crawlers that we're going to be able to split up nice and evenly because we know their weight. I'll just get the scale out and weigh out half of them, and we'll be able to do a nice fair split. Half of the worms will go into one of the bins, the other half will go in the other bin. So let's get those 2 new systems launched. It is showtime. I feel bad for these little guys being out of their element for as long as they've been. So I think it's time to simply release them into their new environments and call it a day. So without any further delay, I'll make sure I've removed all the stragglers from these containers here. But we're going to let these little guys get situated before I walk away. I'm going to try to spread them out a little bit just because I want to give them all fair access to the material right below instead of forcing them to remain in a big mound piled up on top of one another. Hopefully they're able to get comfortable in their new home soon, and then we can call it a day. Well, you know, I think that I must have allowed for a good 5-6 minutes at this point to let these little guys settle in, but I'm starting to question whether I may have not distributed them well enough to enable them to all gain access to the bedding. So I thought I would just come back in here and try to give them a little bit of a hand. It's amazing how slimy these little guys are. I don't know if they're kind of emitting this fluid as sort of a protective measure, because they're very gooey. But I'm wondering if perhaps just by spreading them out a little bit, maybe we can see their recession down into the bedding, pick up the pace a little bit. So I hope it helps. Let's get them spread out a little bit better than they were a moment ago. And hopefully we'll be able to see them all vanish out of view. Or maybe not, I don't know, I'm not sure what to expect. It's taken them quite some time. I think African night crawlers don't react the way other worms do to the bright lights. I think they're a little bit more tolerant of it, so maybe that has partly to do with why they're not boogieing out of view. But let's see if that helps. Hopefully it does. Oops. All right, onward, guys. Well, I think I probably could have done a little bit better spreading these little guys around. But you know what? I don't want to subject them to any more discomfort. I'm just going to lay down a little top covering piece of paper here. And then we're going to be covering up with plastic down here in these containers, just to keep the moisture content in here comfortable for them. The bedding is nice and damp, and I still have just one more final order of business, and then it's quitting time. And I think a lot of you might know what it is. Yep, that's right. Got to christen these bins with their customary labels. So let's get that taken care of now. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming my two newest worm bins to the wormery. African Nightcrawler bin number 1, African Nightcrawler bin number 2. And as always, I'll be looking forward to hearing everyone's comments, because I always like to gather everyone's input on how many worms you think I launched into these systems. If you think they're the same exact number, just give me a number and let me know what you think in terms of it being the amount of worms that were launched into each system. I did take care to measure them in such a way that they were equal, or at least I hope I did. If you think that there was one bin that had maybe more than the other, I'd be interested in hearing that too. Once I've gathered everyone's estimates, we'll do what we always do, which we'll average them all together, and then we'll have official worm counts for these two new systems. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.